Crowned in the early hours of November 17th, 1558, Elizabeth I was just 25 years old. For much of her life, she had lived in the shadow of her half-sister, Bloody Mary, whose reign demanded that Elizabeth constantly suppress her true beliefs, particularly on the matters of religion. The specter of the headsman's axe had loomed over her for years, but perhaps the most formative moment in her life came when, at the age of 8, she witnessed the death of one of her stepmothers. That event led her to make a personal vow never to marry. In the years that followed, Elizabeth's promise would be tested time and again, as the Virgin Queen intimately understood all too well the critical importance of securing the line of succession. Her very birth had been the result of Henry VIII's relentless pursuit of a male heir. When Edward VI died prematurely, the line of succession was altered at the last moment, sparking a rebellion that ultimately led to Mary's ascension as the first ruling queen of England. Elizabeth was far from Mary's first choice to take the throne, but her efforts to find a valid reason to remove her from the line of succession were thwarted. Meanwhile, a tumor near Mary's brain gave a false impression that she was pregnant. 3 phantom pregnancies led her to cling to the possibility that she would be able to place the child of her husband, Spain's Philip II, as the future ruler of England. The future of Catholicism in England hung in the balance, and for Mary, it was the singular cause that consumed her every thought. But while she fought desperately to secure this future, her husband, Philip, was consumed by a far greater fear: the threat posed by Mary Stuart of Scotland. He paid little mind to Elizabeth, dismissing her as a mere young woman he thought he could charm, underestimating the powerful force she would soon become. From the moment she ascended the throne, Elizabeth made it unmistakably clear that she would rule as her father had, thrusting England into religious turmoil amidst the chaos of the religious wars that had ignited across Europe after Martin Luther's bold defiance. With no children of her own and no husband to provide a legitimate heir, Elizabeth's reign hinged on her cousin, Mary, the Queen of Scots, her sole heir to the English throne. In Elizabeth's eyes, Mary was a figure to be watched, a potential ally in waiting. But Mary, with her burning ambition, saw only an obstacle. She was determined to seize power at any cost, even if that meant resorting to murder, including plotting the death of her own husband in her relentless pursuit of the throne. You're listening to Empires, Anarchy, and Other Notable Moments, a podcast designed for deep dives that assists in the teaching of history. This series is about England's greatest monarch, Elizabeth I. Episode number 5, Bess vs. the Queen of Scots. Historian Anne Somerset, our main source for the series, details the position that the young queen found herself in, stating that certainly the state of England lay now most afflicted, embroiled on one side with the Scottish, on the other side with the French war, overcharged with debt, the treasure exhausted, Calais lost, to the great dishonor of the English nation, the people distracted with different opinions in religion, the Queen bar of potent friends, and strengthened with no alliance of foreign princes. It was a woman who had landed the country in such a mess, and it was understandable enough that some people were skeptical that a woman would be capable of freeing them from it. Despite the gravity of her position, Elizabeth exuded an unwavering confidence, convinced that God had guided her every step, protecting her through the treacherous years of her sister's reign. With the throne now firmly in her grasp, she saw no reason why divine favor would abandon her now, believing that her rise was no mere accident, but a part of a higher plan. Despite her modern-day reputation, Elizabeth was not a feminist. Though it isn't a perfect analogy, her stance is best described by the belief that she didn't see gender, or at least she expected others not to see it when they looked at her. She believed that she was expressly chosen by God to rule via the divine right of kings, and as such, gender-based frailties didn't apply to her. She even publicly expressed gratitude to the Almighty for making her, though a weak woman, his instrument of power. Ambassadors immediately noticed her intention to maintain a tight hold on the reins of England, with one observing, "The Queen has a certain air of authority about her. She seems to me incomparable, more feared than her sister, and gives her orders and has her way as absolutely as her father did." This didn't mean, however, that she could do it alone. William Cecil became her principal Secretary of State. While the position had previously been largely ceremonial, it flourished under Elizabeth's reign. Unlike her father's court, where two religious factions constantly manipulated the king to the detriment of the other, Cecil was a true partner in ruling England. He was always vigilant with threats to the Queen, with one servant testifying that in their 24 years together, he never saw Cecil sit idle for even 30 minutes. Somerset teaches us that together the Queen and Cecil forged a unique partnership. For the next 40 years, she rarely took an important decision without consulting him first. Yet, while she had an immense respect for his judgment, she did not defer to it at all times. However, there were at least 2 occasions in the reign when he threatened to resign if Elizabeth did not follow the policy he prescribed, and in both cases, the Queen backed down. Together, they made the Queen's council more efficient, retaining 10 of her sister's advisors while removing 30 others. Privy councils often grew with each other new administration, as firing such well-connected, powerful men was considered a dangerous move. By streamlining the flow of advice, Elizabeth was able to work closely with the men she had personally chosen to manage the day-to-day operations of the nation. She took these bold steps despite the fact that Mary, Queen of the Scots, loomed large as a legitimate threat to Elizabeth's reign. Scotland had long been a thorn in the side of England. From the moment the Romans set foot on the British Isles, the fierce Catalonian Highlanders of Scotland turned back their invaders with daring guerrilla tactics. Frustrated, the Romans built Hadrian's Wall in a desperate attempt to contain the problem, but even that failed to prevent the Picts from launching border raids. In 212, Rome abandoned Scotland, and in 410, it withdrew from all of England. Fast forward to the late 18th century, when the Vikings united Scotland's clans to fight against foreign invaders, including the English, who arrogantly treated their northern neighbor as little more than an extension of their own backyard. Scottish patriots, led by the legendary William Wallace, battled to preserve Scotland's independence, repelling England's relentless advances. Robert the Bruce, after years of struggle, secured a temporary reprieve at the end of the First War of Scottish independence, only for the flames of rebellion to reignite after his death, setting the stage for another bloody conflict. Scotland enjoyed a brief respite as England became consumed by the 100 Years' War in France. But the quiet wouldn't last. Around the time of Mary's birth, the simmering tensions between the two neighbors reignited into violence. Her father, James V, was the King of Scotland and the son of Henry VIII's eldest sister. A devout Catholic, James saw his cousin's excommunication as a divine sign that God had withdrawn his favor from England. Fueled by ambition, he dreamed of uniting England, Ireland, and Scotland under one crown. Yet, his lofty vision quickly crumbled. Defeated by the English at the Battle of Solway Moss, James was soon dead, leaving his infant daughter, Mary Stuart, as his heir, just 6 days old and already burdened with the weight of a kingdom's future. Henry VIII sought to solidify his control over both lands and to mend the fractured ties within his own family by arranging a marriage between his heir, Edward, and the infant Mary. But the Scottish court swiftly rejected the match, citing the deep divide between their faiths. Edward was Protestant, while Mary was a devout Catholic. Outraged by the refusal, Henry launched a brutal campaign known as the War of the Rough Wooing. It was a grotesque display of power, with Henry sending 18,000 men and 30 warships to storm the northern border. The war culminated in a bloody battle that became infamous in Scotland as Black Saturday. Some 6,000 Highlanders perished, and with English forces advancing towards the capital, the Scottish court hastily whisked their infant queen to the safety of France. There, in the heart of the French court, Mary was raised amidst an education fueled by a deep hatred for the English and the cousins who ruled over them. As was to be expected, the rough wooing had the opposite effect of what Henry intended. Instead of breaking Scotland's resolve, it drove Mary into the arms of France, where she married the Dauphin, thus uniting Scotland with England's greatest and most formidable enemy. Religion was the central force directing every decision in the wake of Martin Luther's declaration that anyone could interpret God's teachings. Elizabeth, a devout Protestant, was firmly entrenched in this religious struggle. Her education had been guided by Lutheran Catherine Parr, who had shielded her Lutheran learnings. Moreover, the Queen's own legitimacy hinged on the Protestant beliefs. Henry VIII's break from Rome had cast a long shadow over Elizabeth's birth. To Catholics across Europe, She was a bastard, the product of a marriage deemed invalid by the church, an illegitimate usurper, wholly unfit to claim the throne of England. England's Catholics, who had seen a fleeting revival under the reign of their beloved Queen Mary, were horrified when Elizabeth swiftly restored Protestantism to the throne. In their eyes, the balance had been tipped once again. They turned to Mary as the beacon of hope, a legitimate heir who could restore Catholicism to England once and for all. But despite their fervent desires, killing the young Queen of Scots was never seen as a viable option. Her bloodline, her claim, and her potential to unite England under Catholic rule were simply too valuable. First, Mary was firmly within the legitimate line of succession as established by Parliament. Second, she had the protection of the French courts and eventually became the Queen of France. Third, to kill her would have ignited a rebellion among England's Catholics, plunging the kingdom into a bloody civil war. Spain's Philip II, her widowed husband, was convinced that Elizabeth would be so gripped by fear of the Scottish-French alliance that she would accept his marriage proposal. This was the same Philip who had, in fact, urged his wife to launch the disastrous war against France in the first place. But after 4 months of silence from Elizabeth, the Spaniard moved on, further deepening the vulnerability that Protestant England now felt, isolated and surrounded by enemies on all sides. Elizabeth's approach to religion was a delicate dance. Elizabeth took control of England's religious direction, declaring herself as the head of Church of England through Parliament and enforcing compulsory attendance at Protestant services. Still, she aimed to avoid further conflict by permitting Catholics to abstain from communion as a sign of protest, with a small fine of 1 shilling as the only consequence. It was a strategic compromise that allowed Elizabeth to strengthen her rule while placating her divided subjects. Somerset informs us that so long as her subjects showed outward conformity, there was no effort to delve into their innermost beliefs. It was enough for her that everyone appeared to embrace Protestantism, while the more radical of her subjects condemned the state of religion as no better than a cloaked papistry or mingle-mangle. Rather than trying to sway the masses, Elizabeth focused on securing the loyalty of the church's leadership. She forced bishops to swear oaths of allegiance, encouraged them to maintain Catholic laws regarding clergy marriages, and imposed steep penalties on them for any breaches in decorum, ensuring they conformed to her vision of religious order. In an effort to ease tensions, Elizabeth made peace with France, relinquishing Calais, the last of England's colonial possessions in France, to their age-old enemy. However, even with hostilities ended, the persistent problem of Mary Stuart was far from resolved. Somerset writes that after the French had had time to regroup their forces, there was a real danger that hostilities might break out afresh, and the English were bereft of allies who could help them to fend off such an attack. Conventional wisdom suggests that Elizabeth should do all in her power to bring England out of diplomatic isolation, and if she wished to secure the friendship of a major continental power, she was in many ways well placed to do so, for any foreign alliance could be sealed with the offer of her hand in marriage. At the time, no one believed that she would continue clinging to her childish refusal to marry. Mary's bloodline was the strongest claim to the English throne if Elizabeth were to die unexpectedly. Yet, Elizabeth harbored deep convictions about naming a successor. She had been her half-sister's chosen heir, a position that had placed her at the center of turmoil during Mary's reign. Over the course of 5 years, 3 revolutionary coups were attempted, each aiming at placing the crown of England upon Elizabeth's head. While there are lingering questions about her involvement in the first attempt, it is clear that Elizabeth had no hand in the second and third rebellions. Somerset writes that her own experiences in her sister's reign had left her with the unshakable conviction that, involuntary or otherwise, the sovereign's heir presumptive automatically became the fulcrum for treasonous intrigue. In simpler terms, she was convinced that naming her heir would immediately place a target upon her back. The fact that Mary, Queen of Scots, was Catholic only heightened the threat Elizabeth faced. The two cousins exchanged frequent correspondence, with Mary clearly positioning herself to be named as the rightful heir, while Elizabeth refused to grant her wishes, carefully observing her every move. Historian Kristen Post Walton is quick to point out that the two monarchs never met in person, as it precluded the possibility of the intensely personal dynamic often projected onto them. After all, it's difficult to maintain strong feelings about someone known only through letters and intermediaries. Instead, it's more likely the Queen's attitudes towards each other dictated largely by changing circumstances. This included the surprising death of Mary's French husband in 1561. After 13 years in mainland Europe, she returned home to the land of the Scots. She arrived to discover a land plagued by factionalism and religious discontent. Protestantism had taken root in Scotland during her time in France, with Parliament passing a series of laws that abolished the Pope's authority. This left Mary, as a Catholic queen, stranded in a land that had largely turned its back on her faith, a sovereign surrounded by a nation that no longer recognized her divine authority. The Smithsonian Magazine notes that she formed compromises that enabled her to maintain authority without infringing upon the practice of either religion. She immediately sought to improve relations with Scotland's southern neighbor. Elizabeth revealed the price that Mary would have to pay for her friendship, writing into the Treaty of Edinburgh a line which would permanently bar Mary from ever making a claim to the throne of England. It was too much for Mary, who instead appealed to Elizabeth to focus on their connectedness as queens of the same isle, sharing the same language, and the nearest kinswoman that each other had. Elizabeth never allowed sentiment to cloud her judgment. To her, Mary was by far the most dangerous of the 7 contenders, with a rightful claim to England's throne. In a calculated move, Elizabeth allowed Mary to believe there was still hope, all the while maintaining the ambiguity of her eventual choice to incentivize Scotland to remain firmly aligned with England. It was realpolitik on the grandest scale. Unfortunately, she wasn't the only one affected by the decision. Somerset expresses the fear that if she died unexpectedly, the nation would be plunged into turmoil. The peers of the realm put it in a petition presented to Elizabeth in 1563. The civil wars of the previous century had branded upon the national consciousness of dread of the factious, seditious, and intestine war that will grow through want of understanding to whom they should yield their allegiances and duties, whereby much innocent blood is like to be shed. Many historians, including Somerset, believe that this is why Elizabeth continually dangled the possibility of getting married. If they were focused upon her acrobatics on the matrimonial high wire, then they would stop worrying about the lack of safety net in the form of an assured succession. Amid the evolving circumstances surrounding Mary's return to Scotland, Elizabeth masterfully kept her close, never once offering a definite pledge. Arriving from France, the home of the most cultured court in Europe, Scotland felt like a remote backwater. From the start, Mary struggled to connect with her Protestant subjects, who were especially puzzled by her habit of spending so much time lounging in bed, despite being in perfect health. John Knox became the spark that would ultimately ignite Mary's downfall. As the leader of Scotland's Protestant Reformation, his hatred of the Pope was matched only by his deep disdain for powerful women. He first took aim at Mary Tudor in an essay titled Admonition to the People of England. Calling her a modern-day Jezebel, he applied much of the same logic towards Elizabeth in a work titled The First Blast of the Trumpet Against the Monstrous Regiment of Women. Somerset tells us that for Knox, female rulers represented a gross violation of the natural order, citing biblical texts to prove that they were unfit to wield power and declaring that in view of the inferior sex's inherent sinfulness and mental frailty, it was repugnant to nature, contumely to God, contrary to his revealed will and approved ordinance to permit women to have a dominion over any nation, realm, or city. Knox spoke out continually against Mary, Queen of the Scots, condemning her belief in Catholicism as well as her foreign habits. Despite her personal religious beliefs, Mary reached out to Elizabeth, hoping to restore ties between the two Protestant nations. However, her refusal to relinquish her claim to the throne of England meant that talks went nowhere. In an attempt to break the deadlock, Elizabeth considered meeting her cousin in person, but the questions she raised with her Privy Council seemed irrelevant to the real issues between the young queens. Elizabeth reportedly asked about Mary's exercise, diet, and appearance, even requesting her advisors to examine Mary's portrait and honestly tell her which of them was truly the most beautiful. This odd fixation continued with inquiries like, who is taller? Who dances better? Who is more musically inclined? It bordered on obsession, especially since chroniclers had long celebrated Mary's beauty since her infancy. The two were scheduled to meet in York, but a religious civil war erupted in France between the ruling Catholics and the Protestant Huguenots. Fearing that England could be dragged into the chaos consuming their rival, Elizabeth canceled the meeting with her cousin, choosing instead to remain in the capital. In a half attempt to aid the Protestant rebellion, the young queen ended up sending a small contingent of troops to the continent. it was at this critical juncture that she was struck down by smallpox. Somerset teaches us that Elizabeth was so ill that she lost the faculty of speech, and the physicians were holding out no hope whatsoever for her survival. England was prematurely thrown into a crisis over succession, with each candidate working behind the scenes to assemble their allies. Then, as though she were the mythical phoenix, Elizabeth suddenly rallied, emerging from a state of unconsciousness, during which time she had been wrapped and laid upon a pallet before the fire. She took hold of the English forces in France, securing territory while economically aiding the Protestant rebellions. An act of God forced them off the continent, however, as plague broke out among the troops. Unable to hold their positions, Elizabeth evacuated them back to England. Unfortunately, they brought the disease back with them, causing more than 21,000 fatalities in London. The circumstances shifted again in 1565, when Mary suddenly married Lord Darnley, a man whom Elizabeth, upon first seeing him, declared to be the lustiest and best proportioned tall man she had ever seen. Elizabeth had originally sent the striking young man to Scotland, partly to persuade the Queen of Scots to marry Lord Dudley, a man who had romantically pursued Elizabeth for nearly 2 decades. It was Dudley who decided that Darnley should be the one to travel to Scotland to seal the deal, hoping against hope that the Queen would fall for the younger man instead of himself. Besides being an Englishman, Darnley was also a staunch Catholic. Combined with Mary's decision to bypass Parliament and have him crowned King of Scots, this led to a rebellion known as the Chaseabout Raid. Though she would later deny it, Elizabeth's actions were a direct catalyst for the uprising. She had made it clear to Scotland's leading Protestants that she strongly opposed her cousin's marriage, which they interpreted as a sign that England would support their efforts to right the wrong. However, when the armies clashed near Edinburgh, Elizabeth refused to offer any assistance. For the moment, the furthest Elizabeth would go was to take the rebels' leader, the now deposed Earl of Moray. Though she disapproved of Mary's actions and might have privately relished her downfall, Elizabeth did not condone rebellions. A staunch believer in the divine right of kings, she found it utterly deplorable for ordinary men to overthrow God's chosen ruler. Somerset informs us that Elizabeth wholeheartedly subscribed to the conventional view that a rebel is worse than the worst prince, and the rebellion worse than the worst government of the worst prince. And it was an article of faith with her that those who resisted their prince procured their own damnation. This was, of course, quite hypocritical, as Elizabeth had previously supported rebellions in Scotland against Mary's regime and had backed the French Huguenots. However, her logical reasoning was quickly overridden by emotion when Mary had Elizabeth's special envoy arrested. Somerset informs us that when Elizabeth heard of this insolence, she was besides herself with rage and cried out that she would aid Moray and his cohorts with all the means that God had given her. Yet, she did not follow through, fearing that action against Scotland would provoke France into invading across the Channel in an effort to protect their former queen. Mary began to regret marrying Lord Darnley just weeks into what was supposed to be her happily ever after. His behavior quickly became utterly deplorable. Though he had impregnated his wife, it seems he had no other purpose. To make matters worse, he insulted not only his wife, but also the staff, further eroding any goodwill he had once had. When Mary refused to grant him any power, Darnley descended into a spiral of debauchery, driving his wife into the arms of her Italian Secretary of State for solace. Unraveling further, he found a group of xenophobic allies hoping to overthrow the foreigner, which Darnley wrongly assumed was his wife's lover. They dragged him, shrieking, from Mary's intimate supper room and slaughtered him in cold blood. As the consequences of his actions became clear, Darnley confessed to his wife and betrayed those who had plotted with him. 6 months pregnant, Mary traveled 25 miles, rallying an 8,000-strong army to deliver justice. But by the time she arrived, the killers had already fled the kingdom. Mary, despite the crushing disappointment and betrayal of her marriage, a union Elizabeth had, in part, engineered, made a surprising gesture by naming her cousin as the godmother to her son, James. It was an act of reconciliation, an unexpected olive branch that, for all her frustrations, Mary hoped might heal some of the rift between the two queens. It appeared to have worked, with Somerset telling us that the messenger arrived, authorized to tell Mary that provided she undertook not to press her claim to the English throne during the lifetime of Elizabeth or any of her lawful issues, Elizabeth would see to it that no laws were passed in England that were in any way prejudiced to Mary's title. At last, it seemed that the relationship between Elizabeth and Mary, Queen of Scots, was going to settle down. Trapped in a disastrous marriage to a loathsome scoundrel, Mary took matters into her own hands. Though she would deny it, she secretly hired a team with the sole purpose of blowing up her marriage. Quite literally. Somerset tells us that at 2 o'clock in the morning, the inhabitants of Edinburgh were awoken by the sound of an immense explosion. The blast reduced to rubble a house where the Queen of Scots' husband had recently taken up residence. His lifeless body was found lying in the grounds of the house. It was clear that he had survived the explosion, but had been killed shortly afterwards, having apparently been either strangled or suffocated. That last bit gave the conspiracy away. Unwilling to remain attached to a notorious bastard, yet not wanting to bastardize her son James, she hoped to get away with murder. Unfortunately, few in Scotland believed her. Worse, they quickly figured out that the Earl of Bothwell was her accomplice in the crime. Already unpopular for her foreign influence and steadfast Catholic beliefs, Mary became the target of vicious propaganda that painted her as a prostitute. A month after the explosion, whispers began to spread that Mary was planning to marry the Earl, despite the inconvenient fact that he was already married. From there, the situation grew more bizarre. Somerset tells us that on April 24th, 1567, Bothwell proceeded to stage an abduction of his queen, carrying her off to Dunbar Castle, ostensibly against her will, but few people doubted that Mary had known and approved of his intentions beforehand. There, he made love to her, possibly for the first time, and arguably without her consent, and having made sure of her in this way, he obtained a speedy divorce from his wife and married the Queen on May 15th. The Queen's frail psyche, gripped by what seemed to be Stockholm Syndrome, became a serious threat to England. Bothwell, the new King of Scotland, had been described by one of Elizabeth's advisors as mortal an enemy to our whole nation as any man alive. Things escalated rapidly from there. Mary was pregnant once again, and any son she bore would solidify Bothwell's claim to the throne, displacing James, Elizabeth's godson. Scotland's nobility, having endured enough, rose up to overthrow their queen. Elizabeth, however, once again displayed reluctancy to overthrow a legitimate monarch. She dispatched ambassadors to negotiate Mary's reinstatement to the throne, only to discover, with shock, that the Scots not only planned to block her return, but were contemplating her execution. Calvinist firebrand John Knox had been working behind the scenes to convince them that the Queen had no more right to commit murder or adultery than anyone else. To preserve her life, Mary reluctantly abdicated the throne, passing it to her 13-month-old son, James. A spark of resistance lingered in Mary's heart, prompting her to raise an army a few months later. But her forces were swiftly crushed. She had no choice but to flee. Though France seemed the obvious refuge, Mary turned instead to her cousin Elizabeth, entrusting her future to England. Thus began a 19-year saga that culminated in Mary's execution. Much of the remaining story is rather tedious, so let me speed things up. Knowing that restoring a Catholic queen with a claim to her own throne wasn't in her favor, Elizabeth played a careful double game. While offering Mary the false hope of restoration, Elizabeth kept her cousin imprisoned, albeit in a palace. The English queen initiated an investigation into the death of Mary's husband, the absurdly well-proportioned man whom Elizabeth had had her eye upon. This was no simple task, as any investigation involving a queen required her consent. Additionally, the crime had taken place in Scotland, meaning England had no jurisdiction over the matter. With skillful maneuvering, Elizabeth overcame these issues and seized control of what became known as the Casket letters, damning evidence of Mary's affair with Bothwell. Mary, for her part, denied their validity, insisting that they were elaborate forgeries. With a well-timed revelation of the letters during the investigation, Elizabeth forced Mary to withdraw her consent. In this masterstroke, Elizabeth had discredited her most dangerous rival without resorting to direct punishment. Somerset writes that only by allowing the evidence against Mary to be ventilated had it been possible for Elizabeth to justify her refusal to restore her. But Her aim had always been to vindicate her own actions, rather than condemn Mary for hers. She had no doubt that Mary was both an adulteress and a murderer, and had managed to avoid formally labeling her as either. And in accordance with such consideration, she prided herself on having treated her cousin better than she deserved. Under the guise of protection, Mary was ruthlessly shuffled from one location to another, as though a pawn in a deadly game, to shield her from the supposed threat of assassination. Despite these elaborate measures, historian Mark Cartwright notes that, even in confinement, Mary remained a threat to Elizabeth. The former Scottish queen had become a symbol for Catholic-inspired plots to dethrone Elizabeth. In 1569, a rebellion broke out in northern England, stirred by the Earls of Northumberland and Westmoreland, both staunch Catholics. The rebels hoped to place Mary on the throne and secure a marriage alliance with one of their own. Elizabeth responded decisively, sending an army that forced the rebel leaders to flee in panic. 900 rebels were rounded up and executed. And in a move that cemented her perilous position, the Pope excommunicated Elizabeth. In the end, her actions proved Elizabeth's early assertion that she would wield power with the same iron fist as her father. In 1571, a shadowy plot emerged, one that threatened the very heart of Elizabeth's reign. Behind it stood Mary, Queen of Scots, who, still imprisoned by her cousin, had pledged allegiance to Philip II of Spain. By naming him her heir, Mary set in motion a deadly scheme. Philip would invade England in an attempt to overthrow his sister-in-law Elizabeth, a woman he had once courted and been rejected by. With her own cousin conspiring against her, Elizabeth faced a crisis that struck at every core of her rule, blending personal betrayal with political treason. Double agents intercepted the letters outlining the plot, leading to Mary's trial for treason. Despite her claims of innocence, she was found guilty and sentenced to death. Yet, Elizabeth hesitated, unable to sign the death warrant for 4 agonizing months. She finally gave her consent and requested that Parliament consult her before the actual execution took place. Sensing her continual indecision, they bypassed her, and with a swift action, they took the head of the Queen of Scots. Eyewitnesses were left stunned by the spectacle, with one contemporary account recalling the Queen as she removed her outer garments, received her blindfold, and silently uttered a prayer while kneeling at the executioner's block. With the fall of the sword, the executioner stood over the lifeless body and proclaimed in a booming voice, "Such is the end of all the queens and the gospel's enemies." It was only then that the assembled crowd gasped as they saw the dead woman's dress stir, as if her headless body sought to rise. The executioner, startled, reached down and pulled from the voluminous skirt of her gown her beloved Skye Terrier. The dog had refused to leave her side. In shock, the executioner dropped the animal, only to watch it climb atop her lifeless form, refusing to part from its dead master. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you want to interact with the show, you can email us at resourcesbylowery@gmail.com or contacting Empires Pod on Bluesky. If you'd like to financially support the show, please look at the description for more information. As always, thank you for listening, rating the show, and spreading the word.